just books in the background or something like that.
I am pushing us to Facebook. Let's see how long it takes until it finds it. Hope I did it right. You never know with me.
I think so, because I get a
Says
notification every time we go live.
Oh, cool. Good morning, everybody. I hope you can find this video, and welcome to Coffee with the Pastor. And you got coffee with two pastors right now with me, sorry. But then our own Drew Bowen. So I'm trying to find it on my phone here. So that's how I watch the comments and engage the comments. There it is. There we go. Hi. So so say hi if you're here. Hi Tiffany. Hi Sierra. Hey Peace of Christ Church, whoever it is that's commenting from there. Hey Amanda.
How's it going, y'all?
Yeah, hey, we'll wait just a minute while everybody jumps on. I hope you two got the memo that it is blue shirt and hat day, because Drew and I both have on blue shirts and hats and beards. Blue shirt, hat, and beard day. And no glasses day. And hey, in the comments, bonus points if you can find something weird or odd or different. Not weird, just different in Drew's background. other than Drew himself.
I feel like I'm more in the foreground than the background, though.
Sure. Yeah. Hey, good morning, Sarah and Mary and Tiffany. For those who don't know Drew, first of all, I'm sorry. You need to know this guy. He is a fantastic person, but he is a vibrant member of Peace. Yes, you are. Don't be humble. And oh, good job, Tiffany. Upside down map. Maybe Drew can explain that in just a moment. And he's the program director. Did I get that right?
Yep.
Out at Camp of the Hills, which is this fantastic camp out toward Marble Falls. You know, I love going out there. It's a beautiful place. We've had a couple of retreats out there. I'm ambivalent though, because I come from Lampasas, Texas, home of the Battling Badgers, and Marble Falls, the Mustangs, they were one of our big rivals, and along with the Burnett Bulldogs. So maybe they didn't feel like Lampasas was one of their rivals because we were so small, and you know, we weren't all uppity like them because they have a lake and we don't. But we always felt like they were one of our rivals. And if any year that we could beat Marble in football, the whole season is a win. Like we could go, you know, with one win and 9 losses. But if that one win is Marble, whatever, you know, the head coach gets to keep his job probably. So,
you know, that makes sense. And to be fair, y'all had a much better mascot. I feel like Badger, like that's a really strong and more unique mascot. And Mustangs, Bulldogs, like those are a dime a dozen. But Badger, that makes me think back to Wind in the Willows. So I'm all for that.
You know, right? Well, the humble Badger. Let's be honest, it's a humble mascot. Our coach used to tell us, boys, pound for pound, there is no animal more ferocious than a badger, and we held on to that, you know, and especially like I'm a pretty small guy, but I was our biggest linebacker. I was even the strong side linebacker, and look at me at 150 pounds, you know. So we were built like badgers. We were not big. We were small, and we had to be ferocious.
Well, okay. It looks like a couple of people noticed the map being upside down, or so it seemed. My mom actually got me this map, and it's not necessarily upside down. It was actually made to be this way with south pointing up, just as a reminder that just because you've always looked at something in one way doesn't mean that's the right way to look at it or the only way to look at it. So I see this across from my desk every day, and I try to let it remind me, hey, look at things from different perspectives, because there are more than one way to look at a lot of things.
I love it. Are all the words oriented upward with it facing that way? Yeah, so
Yes.
it's not just a map turned upside down. Like, this took some doing to create.
Yeah, this one's on purpose.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Ooh, Tiffany, you're right. Hutto Hippo's definitely ferocious. I'd say probably my favorite of all the local mascots. Hippo's right up there.
Yeah, ferocious. You're right. Hippos are ferocious. Now, I said pound for pound, badgers are the most ferocious. Now, if you can get a hippo-sized badger versus a hippo-sized hippo, then we got an apples to apples comparison. That would be an epic battle. I would love to see.
Yeah. And now I'm imagining a badger-sized hippo and thinking that would be a really cool pet.
Okay, so people didn't jump on to listen to me talk about the ferocity and merits of the humble badger. Although I haven't even talked about the honey badger yet. Anyways, they dialed in not to see me, but to see you, Drew. So let me hand it over to you, our guest pastor for the day, and certainly a friend of mine and a peer in ministry, somebody that I consider a peer and a fellow pastor doing good work in this world. So, my friends, Drew Bowen.
Hey, thanks so much. I appreciate the opportunity. One other interesting thing in the background that wasn't mentioned, there's a poster over there. You probably can't see it well. It's me and my dad. My dad was a celebrity chef for a fundraiser one time and had me help out with it. So I got to be a celebrity chef, which was interesting. So lots of stuff in the background here. But so as we were trying to figure out, I was thinking through what do I want to talk about? What do I want to share? Basically, I've been reading a book that I think is really interesting and helping me think through some things that making me think some new things and giving me words for some of the things that have been just a little bit difficult for me to think through. And I'm not very far into it, so I'm not going to give it like the full endorsement yet. But I was thinking of kind of almost like a book club dating video of, hey, here's a little taste. And if any of y'all want to read this book as well with me, feel free to let me know, because I love discussing books. And this one's been really interesting so far. So the book is Saved from Sacrifice, A Theology of the Cross by S. Mark Heim. I have no idea who this person is, but I'm really enjoying his book. So there are a couple of different things that I wanted to share about it. Oh, hey, Tori. Hey, Brittany. So just sort of starting out, one of the things that struck me right on the first page is it's talking about how if there's a doctrine that you're working with, if it's even just if you're misunderstanding it just a little bit, it can really affect a lot of different things. So talking about how it's easy to write a book that's very much all for something or very much all against something. The author says this: to flatly endorse or condemn something, a doctrine or idea, is straightforward. To propose one alternative to replace another is likewise pretty clear, though the details can be complicated. But to explain how something of surpassing value, with only a subtle twist, becomes a twin of almost opposite character and effects, or how a teaching that rightly merits rejection might still contain rare and profound truths, we lose at our peril. these things are hard to do. And it goes on to say, understanding of the cross is a snarled theological knot at the center of a wide web of assumptions and practices in church and in society. Until it is untangled, it tugs everything else askew, a little or a lot. And so, as Matt mentioned, I'm the program director out here at Camp of the Hills. And, you know, I've been a part of this place for a long time. And one of the things that we do out here is we have a reenactment of the crucifixion during weeks that we have campers out here. And having seen that play hundreds of times at this point, and having played everyone from like unnamed random apostle number 3 to Jesus to soldier, like I've been a part of it in a lot of different ways. So I've thought about the crucifixion and the theology of the cross having to do devos before and after. And it just makes me think, man, how do the ways that we think about the crucifixion and what Jesus is doing there affect the ways that we live out our life? So I wanted to jump over a couple of pages into the intro, and I find this really interesting. So I'm guessing quite a few of y'all have already learned about this, but something that I didn't learn until I was in my mid-20s in a Bible college was that there are multiple different ways of thinking about what God was doing through Jesus during Jesus' life here on earth. So there was the one that I was taught most growing up, sort of substitutionary atonement, but that wasn't the only way. And as I learned about some of the other ways of thinking about what Jesus is doing, I was really taking it the way that some of those, even if they hadn't been explained explicitly, they were still woven into the fabric of what I was taught. So I'm going to read through these 4 different ways of understanding what Jesus is doing. And I'd love to hear from y'all in the comments about which ones, if you grew up in the church, which ones did you hear the most? Which ones are you identifying with the most now? Are there any that you're like, oh, well, I feel like that one's kind of problematic and I've had some trouble with that. I just love to hear some from y'all on how these affected you and how they've been a part of who you are. So, as I mentioned, substitutionary atonement, it says, the belief that God's redemptive plan revolves around offering an innocent Jesus for punishment and death in place of a guilty humanity, allowing a just God to practice mercy by saving sinners whose debt had been paid by God's suffering on their behalf. So that's definitely the one that I heard the most growing up, but not the only way. So the second is the moral influence or exemplarist. That's a hard one. Exemplarist theory that suggests the death is meant to save us by making such a moving exhibition of God's love that we are inwardly stirred to gratitude and service in return. So it says Jesus' death is heroic. It demonstrates perseverance in the right to the final limit of human life. So basically saying, if God loves us so much that God is willing to die for us, that shows us this depth of love and exemplifies how love can be woven into life. Shows us an example of, hey, here's what we're to do for others. So we got substitutionary atonement and exemplar. Another major option is the Christus Victor theory. that sees in the cross a victory of God over third parties that hold humanity in bondage, whether these parties be death, sin, or demonic powers. So the basic idea that in Christ's death and resurrection, God has defeated death, has won over sin, and has given us the victory through that act. And then the fourth one, which I'd been taught the first three in college, but I hadn't heard this one really explained well until reading this book. Shout out to Dr. Brady Bryce for being the first one to tell me about sort of the first three. Yet a fourth approach views the incarnation as a whole as the saving work. It is Bethlehem as much as Calvary that changes us. The divine nature is infused into humanity, and Christ is the vaccination point from which this healing power radiates into the bloodstream of our collective human nature. God retraces the whole pattern of human life, from birth and growth to vocation and death, transforming from within what has gone wrong with sinful humanity. So I saw several people putting in their own thoughts. Was that, yeah, a lot of people saying that penal substitution was the way that they were brought up, but not necessarily the only way that they have been seeing it more recently. I like what Tori mentioned about Jesus as the Lamb and the Lion of Judah. And did I see that Jana was the one commenting as Peace of Christ, moral exemplar? I feel like that was a big one for me as well, and has been more and more in the last few years. So I think the more I've learned about these different ways of viewing what God did through Jesus, the more I can see ways that that was taught to me, even if it wasn't explicitly. So I think about Sunday school classes when I was growing up, and how there was so much emphasis on being like Jesus. And even though it was never explicitly said, hey, what Jesus was doing was setting an example for all of us. And that's the main thrust of what God is trying to do through Jesus. Still, that message of Jesus is the ultimate example of love, and we should be doing our best to follow that. I think that was still woven into what I was learning growing up. And in the same way, the Christ has become victorious. I feel like there were tons of songs growing up that says that talks about the victory of Jesus over death in the cross and the celebration of the victory of resurrection. So even though it wasn't necessarily preached as much as, hey, Christ has died for you, Christ gave his life for you to sacrifice to save you from your sins, the penal substitutionary atonement type thing, I feel like I still heard that. I heard parts of these different ways of viewing God's love. So thinking through that, the author talks about how each of those sort of characteristics and almost job titles of who Jesus is and what Jesus is doing, each of them is connected in one of these ways. He goes on to write, Christian theology traditionally then sees three elements of the human condition that are in need of transformation: sin, estrangement from God; evil, estrangement among humans; and death, mortality and our estrangement from nature. The three offices of Christ, priest, prophet, and king, are shorthand expressions of this. Christ's priestly work is to restore our connection with God. Christ's prophetic work is to overcome the evil that breaks relations among humans. And Christ's royal work as king is to restore and renew the divine purpose in created nature, defeating death. I'm just saying, yeah, the turtles in the background are on purpose. I figured, just in case, there are kids watching, or there are people who aren't super interested in all of these big words that I'm just really excited to be trying to read through. Turtles and fish, upside down maps. I think it's help. So the idea of Jesus as priest, prophet, and king, addressing those three main needs. And I like the way that shows that Jesus is doing more than one thing. There's another quote in here that I really liked. It says, so the author is talking about how theology is more than just the one thing. There's more going on than just one aspect. And he says, you cannot see all sides of a 3D object at once, but you have to register the reality of all three dimensions to perceive its full reality. So I think about that and think, okay, well, even though there's some really unhelpful things about substitutionary atonement theology, it helps me to understand where it's coming from. And even though I think there's more to what Jesus was doing than just the exemplar, I think that was also a huge part of what's going on when Jesus is here on earth. So each one of these is one facet of Jesus. And I don't think it's necessarily bad or wrong to say, okay, well, right now I identify more with this. I'm in a tough spot, and this is the part of what Jesus is doing that is most helpful to me. It doesn't mean that we're throwing away everything else. It doesn't mean that we don't think that's important, but we can see, okay, well, if I'm having trouble right now with substitutionary atonement, if that just is really problematic in a lot of ways to me, I can go ahead and say, okay, well, that's not the totality of who Jesus is. It's not all of what Jesus is doing. And maybe I can focus in on some of these other things and then use that as a jumping off point and come back and see the rest of this. So as somebody who's maybe, I think it would be fair to say, I have trended more progressive as far as my theology in the last few years, especially considering where I grew up and the theology that I learned a lot of times growing up. So it's easy for me to try to throw out some of the stuff that I was taught earlier and trying to, I really liked the way Fran put it a few years back in a sermon when she was talking about deconstruction of your faith, and eventually how if you keep deconstructing, eventually you'll be left with nothing. You need to be able to tear down the parts of the building that are problematic and unhelpful, but be able to see the good and the beautiful that's already there. And, maybe it just needs a little spit shine. And I really like thinking about that. And I've discussed that sermon with several friends, and it's been really helpful. So I've been trying to use that when thinking about substitutionary atonement, because in a lot of ways, I do see it as problematic. And I have more hangups with it than I do with other parts of what Jesus is doing. The question of, why does God require the death of Jesus in order to forgive us? It's something that I stumble over a lot. And it's just a hard thing to work through. And I don't want to get to the point where I'm overthinking myself into complete paralysis, but I also don't want to think uncritically about something that's, so much at the heart of God's story of how God is changing the world. So here in this introduction, it talks a little bit more about some of the things that are challenging about that view of what God's doing, and finds ways to see the good. So a little later it says, in Jesus' death, we do see an overpowering image of the truth such theologies assert, that forgiveness is costly and that God is willing to suffer on behalf of each person in order to redeem us. And I think that's a really helpful thing to remember, that oftentimes gets lost when we're just jettisoning this way of thinking about the gospel. To say, hey, we have value in God's eyes, so much value that God is willing to go through this. And even if we don't understand all the reasons why, even if we don't understand exactly what's happening through Jesus' death, the fact that God chooses to do so out of love for us, I think that really speaks to our worth in God's eyes. And as somebody who oftentimes has self-worth issues, thank you, clinical depression, it's a helpful reminder that God loves us so much that these are the lengths that God is willing to go to in order to show love to us. So another part on here that I really liked is it's talking about how comments are coming in. It talks about how there's what the author calls the myth of redemptive violence. The idea that, okay, well, if God has this great and grand plan for humanity, and at the center of that plan is violence, the violent death of Jesus on a cross. If that's the case, then it makes violence seem like something that's not beyond God's scope and plan. It says in here, the Passion narratives tell the old story. They tell the story of redemptive violence as a sinful human construct for peacemaking, not a divine institution. God is not the author to the process, but the one crushed by it. God reverses the violence of the cross and vindicates the victim executed on it. Not sure if we've still got video. Do we still have video going?
Yeah, I believe we're still live and rolling, man.
Okay. Well, then I just ran out of video. So I don't know what's going on, but that's all right. So I'll keep going on that. The idea that God doesn't plan out, hey, this is what we want. This is what my plan is, that violence will be the thing that saves everybody. But instead of that, God says, okay, well, humanity has taken violence and turned it into something to unify. The idea of the scapegoat. Okay, well, we're having problems, so we're going to use violence to create unity amongst our group, whether that's me against my brother, or my brother and me against our cousin, our brother, our cousin, and me against a neighboring community, or our neighboring community as a whole against another nation. So often, violence is used as a way to unify at the expense of the other. And instead of using that, we see Jesus come in and become that scapegoat, to come in to this idea of redemptive violence and to upend it, to turn it around and say, this isn't the way that we're going to go about things. So sort of the closing that I wanted to leave us with is something to think about. And then I noticed Tori said that she wanted to talk about this more. If anybody else is interested in thinking through and talking about these kind of ideas, or reading through the book, I'd be thrilled. But here's sort of the conclusion that, at least out of the intro, that I found really helpful. The resurrection of the crucified one brought with it not righteous vengeance, but the formation of an odd new community that gathered around him. This community deployed a whole range of elements to substitute for scapegoating. Christians celebrated their ritual remembrance of Jesus' death, not with copycat killings or new sacrifices, but with a meal of bread and wine. This was the sacrifice of praise that they believed powerful enough to do what violent scapegoating had hitherto done in human history. They celebrated not their unanimity against a victim, but their identification with the crucified one. And so with all those placed in a similar position. They remembered that at this death, Jesus' disciples had played the roles of betrayer, deserter, and denier. Therefore, they faced a reminder that they too were not free of the sin that leads to the cross and were in need of a conversion. When I read that, I think, man, there are so many times when we want to put the onus of our frustration on somebody else. It's the politician that I don't like. It's the group of people that I think aren't living up to the standards that I would hope. It's this other country that I think isn't doing things the right way. It's this other church that I don't think believes things the right way. And yet, Jesus shows, by radically becoming the scapegoat that there's another way, that we can choose to not respond with violence, that that's not the only way of unifying, and that if we can take on the mantle of the one who sacrifices, the one who sees the good in those around them, even when those around them are, showing violence. I feel like that's something that can be really meaningful and can help us to see the cross and the crucifixion and what Jesus is doing there, maybe in a new light. And it's another way of understanding what Jesus is doing that still involves being an example to us, still involves having victory over death, still involves substituting himself for others, but does it in a way that's different and hopefully doesn't exalt the idea of redemptive violence, which has tons of challenges that can be unpacked at a different time. But just sort of thinking through, hey, if Jesus is going to be doing this, if Jesus is going to become a scapegoat on our behalf, how do we think through becoming that for the people around us? So I think that's most of what I was hoping to share. Sorry for the video going out on my end and then I got all confused, but Matt, what else we got?
That was very helpful. I love the arc of the whole thing, beginning with talking about theory and theology and moving toward personal responsibility and how we tend to scapegoat. And here at the end, you have me thinking I would love to have a discussion about the myth of redemptive violence and how that intersects with and what it means for perhaps the defund the police movement and movements like that. Because I think these theories and these theologies have real life application, which I think is what you're pushing us toward as well. The second thought that I had going through my mind is that kind of famous statement that all models and all theories are wrong, but some are helpful.
Yeah.
All theology is wrong, but some of it's really helpful. All models are wrong, but some is helpful. And that just tells me not to make any theory or theology to elevate that to the status of God itself, but to always let that be something that I engage critically. So all this has been super helpful. Thank you, Drew, for taking time out of your day, out of your work day, to share some of your life and your thoughts with us.
Super glad to do it, and glad to be a part of this community, and really thankful for the ways that being a part of Peace of Christ has been such a helpful and healthy piece of my walk of faith, especially in the last few years. I needed this place, and I'm grateful to be a part of it and to hopefully be able to give back a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad to be a part of this community as well. It's a community of life that I need, where we can gather around and say, we're not first a believing, thinking community. We're a community that's practicing love and trying to weave our lives together for the wholeness of our community and the broader community around us. Okay, well, goodbye, everybody. Thanks for dialing in today and joining us. And we hope you have a fantastic Tuesday. Thanks again to Drew.